that really sets me up for failure here. So the genesis of this paper, as Jean-Paul said, is in my PhD, and I'm reading something of an abridgment of it or some themes from that. So at the outset, my aim was to investigate the concept of the contemporary, which is a big buzzword around Goldsmiths then and probably still is now. And while it quickly became apparent that the breadth of the concept presented major obstacles in my path, I remain attached then, as I do still, to investigating something of a sense of the contemporary, especially in those moments when it seems most precarious, heterochronic, out of joint. So writing in the 14th century, Jami al-Tawarikh, the Compendium of Chronicles, the Persian Muslim historian Rashid ad-Din wonders at the Babel that is the West in his eyes. He says, the Franks speak 25 languages, and no people understands the language of the other. All they have in common is their calendar, script, and numbers. For the Islamic world of the time in the 14th century, where 2 or 3 languages formed the basis of an empire and its communications, Arabic was installed firmly as an official language, the seeming linguistic chaos of the Europeans or Franks must have seemed untenable. From the center of the Mongol Empire stretching across half the planet, how could one imagine lands where traveling a few miles in any direction meant risking incomprehensibility? We can sense the wonder in Rashid ad-Din's remark, and see something also of the worldview that was emerging around his own civilization, one that resulted in the extraordinary ambition of his universal history, which was one of the first such universal historical projects. So it is worth remembering at the start of any study of globalization or westernization today, which this is, that similar processes of linguistic and cultural aggregation have taken place before, have retreated, and re-emerged again. Forgetting discontinuity and reversals abound in history and in the philosophy of history. So can we, some 700 years on from Rashid ad-Din, speak of the West with such naive conviction today? As a traveler, a writer, and artist moving from the Islamic Republic of Pakistan to Great Britain, my deepest instincts have been to challenge the idea of the East as a place where I supposedly come from. So both West and East were at the outset dangerous concepts that failed to speak for me entirely. And this is something of the sort of unchallenged legacy of post-colonial theory and its applications in the arts. Indeed, the idea of coming from anywhere is disturbing to those of us who have felt at one time or another restricted to a geographic or ethnic subjective position. On this view, certain features of our global civilization are universal or are presented in a way where difference is as imperceptible as it is irrelevant. If one takes away the subject matter, walking through a contemporary art biennial in Kochi or Venice or Lahore, could one with any certainty tell the European work from the Indian or Pakistani? The homogeneity of form, style, and even attitudes, perhaps, speaks of a globe that has become one world and that we assume on a daily basis a frictionless communication between people in urban capitals everywhere, regardless of religion, race, and culture. Now, is this not an unmitigated blessing? Compared to a recent past, where non-Western modernisms were generally considered derivative, etiolated versions of an original living Euro-American culture, surely the smooth contemporaneity of the International Art Fair is a fairer and more representative model of the diversity of the world. And yet, paradoxically, this contemporaneity might come about at the cost of genuine, deep difference, which is what I'm trying to get at here. The eradication of otherness producing a presumption of sameness. I'm exploring here the possibility that beneath this uniformity, a radical difference might still operate, that what we understand by a form of life in the philosophy of Wittgenstein and world in Jean-Luc Nancy's might help us find the contours of this differential field. Perhaps it might even be possible to think anew of how we come to think of Eastern and Western, how we deploy these terms, that is, Muslim and Christian, religious and secular bodies, and how these oppositions can be seen to shape the picture of our world. So I want to quickly look at a little bit of art to set this up. I didn't do enough of that in my dissertation, like many Goldsmith's dissertations. But I want to talk quickly about a certain kind of emerging art of traveling in in-betweenness, which characterizes the Global International Art Fair, or at least I'm suggesting that it does. So this sort of art that explores liminal spaces of global identity, the non-places and heterotopias that mark the space of the cosmopolitan artist and theorist, arrival halls in airports, immigration counters, passport offices, etc., etc. And all of these symbols supposedly help us to rethink identity in terms of what Erich Rogoff, who looks at such work in Terra Infirma, calls a complex multi-positionality. So Erich Rogoff identifies things like luggage, mapping, borders as symbols of this kind of emerging art, which from the 90s till the present moment. And I'm just going to show a few of these slides. My homeland is not a suitcase, which is a line from a very famous Mahmoud Darwish poem. The much slicker design studio work of Dila Scofidio Renfro, Tourism Suitcase Studies, this one which was sponsored by Samsonite as well at that time. There's a Pakistani artist, Ali Hassan Khan, and this is 2000, so just around a very tense time before a certain complete break in the relationship between Pakistan and the West, as it were, where she placed these suitcases, suspicious-looking suitcases, in various places around New York, where she was living at the time, making these sort of stories around them. And more recently, Umar Mulji's work at the Dubai Art Fair in 2008, Arabian Delight. This particular work, which was of course removed Arab sensibilities about camels, were offended in the process of producing this. So the Sheikh had this work removed, which is neither here nor there to this. But right, so luggage mapping, the very famous Mona Hatoum work, present tense, which is the 2,400 blocks bars of soap made with Palestinian olive oil and sort of disputed territories marked over there, and of course the very well-known hot spot. So as we can see between these works, there's a shared sense of making visible something, which is the fragility, the aesthetics, absurdity, and danger of boundaries and identities. What is also common is an undergirding of the idea of art as exposure, as presentation. So it's not my intention to criticize this art of exposure or to argue against multi-positionality as such, but to contest the ways in which it is constituted, and to remark that the powerful critiques of Western cultural and scientific universalism that produced Said's Orientalism might today have more to account for than the condition of the cosmopolitan subject, the Mr. In-Between of Haber's theory of hybridity and mimicry. Specifically, the so-called return of religion on the theoretical and political planes, devastatingly so in the latter case, demanded re-evaluation of the possibilities of art to think subjectivity, Orientalist or Occidentalist, religious or secular, in ways that mirror the particular strangeness and persistent unknowability of the globe today, in places far removed from cosmopolitanisms, secularism, airports, universities, art biennials, and colloquialism. Muslim or indeed non-secular subjectivity on this reading is a resistant remainder from theories of hybridity and Orientalism, a historical position that partially refuses the embrace of the universal site of the cosmopolis or its simulacrum, the art biennial. In what follows, I will try to outline how the value of an outside, of persistent otherness, might be reconceived and deployed against hybridity and in-betweenness. So the one philosopher who still stubbornly uses terms like the West and Christendom, Christianity, is Jean-Luc Nancy, especially in his work on the deconstruction of Christianity. Nancy reads the historical movement from Greek philosophy to Christianity, to the modern and the secular, as an unbroken one and as one that contains an inner logic. So this logic, Nancy claims, is basically auto-deconstructive and apparatic, and Christianity becomes a name for a certain openness to auto-deconstruction, a withdrawal and abstraction which shapes the globalizing world as we encounter it today. So this withdrawal is, according to Nancy, an intimate rapport with groundlessness, which he in his most recent formulation calls adoration. Adoration in its simplest sense is a relation to the infinite, or a stance of thought that refuses to transfer ultimate meaning to an outside of the world. That in fact refuses an ultimate meaning at all in favor of an acknowledgement of the ineffability of God, and in the modern world replacing God with the world itself. So it might seem strange to attribute a refusal of an outside to Christianity, especially early Christianity with its apocalyptic eschatological dimensions, its belief in afterlives, paradise, etc. But Nancy insists that the unavailability of the Christian God has already begun the process where monotheism must confront itself as an atheism as well at the same time. And with this caveat, we can conclude that the many outsides of Christianity, in other words, its miraculous, magical nature, are at the same time inside the world, demystifying and mystifying simultaneously. So when secular society takes up the task of adoration, previously assigned to the relationship between man and God, adoration becomes the relation to relation itself. So this is Nancy's out from the sort of ethical dilemma of modernity as he sees it. So for Nancy, incidentally, this adoration is specifically Abrahamic. Indeed Christian and certainly not polytheistic, because of the polytheistic need for a well-constructed other world, or what Nietzsche calls backworlds. So without these backworlds or ultimate causes or teleologies, the Christian experience of life becomes essentially one of risk, chance, and leaps. That is, to put it plainly, the removal of all givens lends an urgency to life that is far removed from the supposed fatalism of pre-monotheist society. So at this point, Nancy, I think, comes as close as he can to pointing to an ethical agenda. The auto-deconstruction of religion, of Christianity in particular, led historically to what he calls an enclosure, that of enlightenment, a closing off of all dimensions of the outside, a faith in progress and reason, that is, along with faith in the progress of reason. So the task in the present is to break this enclosure and to open reason, quote, to its very own reason and perhaps to its unreason. This disenclosure serves as the fundamental gesture of what must for Nancy be a working over of the legacy of our provenance towards a becoming and exceeding itself, a turning against itself that allows or opens an affirmation of sense as the sense of the world. So as Nancy says, there is not even atheism. Atheist is not enough. It is the place or position of the principle itself that must be emptied out. So this place presumably is what requires us to choose in Nancy between immanence and transcendence, inside and outside, according to the severe monotheist logic, which unravels under its own contradictions. So how can we imagine, with this picture that Nancy paints with him and against him, an unraveling of other religions and other civilizations in the present, which is becoming one world, which is being globalized? How is it possible to maintain a place for cultures which are not part of the privileged event of Christianity and its deconstruction, but are merely collateral damage in the takeover, the becoming one of the world, the becoming west of the globe, which is something that Nancy explicitly refers to? Is there a corresponding Muslim or polytheistic or non-Christian, rather, globalization and a non-Christian adoration, in other words? Now, Nancy's aim is to convey, I think, a sense of the world here that has not entirely outgrown the legacy of Christianity. He says, why speak of Christianity? In truth, I would like to speak of it as little as possible. I'd like to move towards an effacement of this name and of the whole corpus of references that follows it. But I do think it is important to follow the movement that this name has named, that of an exit from religion and of the expansion of the atheistic world. And elsewhere, this world is indeed ours, everyone's. Here I start speaking out from what is called the Western tradition, Greek, Latin, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, without forgetting that henceforth the West no longer exists. Finding itself everywhere, it is no longer anywhere in particular. So this prevalence of the West comes at the ultimate price, which is that of its own annihilation. Its very ubiquity leaves it unnamed, unnameable, absent, and withdrawn. Now for Nancy, I must point out that Islam, along with Judaism, are too strongly religious to allow the opening to modernity that Christianity offered. They're not withdrawn or abstract enough, they're too tied to dogmas and rituals, to observances. Now, Nancy, however, does acknowledge at other places the mystical vein in both Islam and Judaism that dissipates observance in favor of adoration. In quoting Ibn al-Arabi and Mansur al-Hallaj, he even shows an entirely admirable, if very brief, engagement with this tradition within Islam. So both these religions are constitutionally able in their mystical dimension to exceed religion as dogma. Nonetheless, Nancy maintains these both remain systems of observances and rituals, and he finds it, quote, difficult to see how they could be secularized in the manner of Christianity. So, while one may object to this quick characterization and provide counterexamples of precisely such secularism in the midst of the histories of Islam and Judaism, I think it's important to follow Nancy's thought to its next consequential step. So, perhaps what Nancy is implying here is the presence of a tension between the secular and the religious institutions that was part of the developing condition of Christianity, and that maintained itself until the very recent past, in the process fabricating the West and secularism as this very struggle. So this struggle, this tension between the abstraction and the real practice of Christianity becomes somehow the West, becomes the movement of globalization. In comparison, the anthropologist Talal Asad, and now I'm bringing in a completely different person here, examines how notions such as pain and violence are construed within the frameworks of various cultures, secular, religious, etc., and how these cultures are in turn at least partly characterized by these attitudes and legal and social norms. Therefore, Asad defends the use of terms such as the West, Christianity, and Islam, inasmuch as these function as bearers of meaning and common usage, without necessarily being tied to a fixed or central referent. Now, Asad uses a very Wittgensteinian approach towards naming and language games here. The West for Asad is not then the source of an attitude towards suffering or sacrifice, but is instead what emerges as a picture from looking at instances of the discourse surrounding pain, to cite just one of his particular works. As Asad points out, binary oppositions in and of themselves are not evil. The use of binary distinctions does not necessarily presuppose that the things so divided are in themselves unified or homogeneous or permanently set. And so, defending his use of terms such as European and Islamic, he can speak of a European project that has an underlying aim, which is the making universal of laws, norms, behaviors, and judgments that have their roots in a particular, possibly Christian, time and place. So this project, he stresses, is not limited to Europeans, nor does it require cultural homogeneity. Instead, it seeks to spread certain, quote, shared modalities of legal, moral behavior, forms of national political structuration, and rhythms of progressive historicity. So we can see here that Asad makes a fine distinction between cultural forms and regulative beliefs and structures, where the globalization or universalization of the latter does not necessarily bring about the homogenization of the former. This refinement might be seen as some comfort to those who fear globalization as precisely such a leveling of form. On the other hand, it might suggest a cultural expression in not accurately reflecting the overcoming of one worldview by another is powerless in the face of a rampant globalization. So my own reading is that for Asad, cultural expression represents the possibility of escaping rigidly imposed values, Eastern and Western universalizations and measures, through a cultivation of difference, even of suffering and pain. So the hermit, the masochist, the deviant share with the poet and the artist perhaps an idiorhythmy, to use Roland Barthes' phrase, and to echo Asad's own talking about rhythms of progressive historicity. How this ruptured life comes to take place, whether it is out of choice or through a constitutional difference, madness, depression, insomnia, sexual perversion, unrecognized desire, allows us to look at the process of creativity as an unruliness and untimeliness rather than as a linear response to the demand of history. So what Asad is looking for is a way of continually seeking novelty to break out of what he sees as a sort of dialectical Hegelian impulse in continental philosophy. Asad as an anthropologist and a philosopher as much as he is influenced by the analytical school. So juxtaposing Asad's understanding of secularism, complex, granular, varying across space and time, with non-sees, derived from the Greek Christian world, allied with the becoming world of the West, opens up deep questions about how an avowedly secular world might face its obverse, and what space for non-conformity might remain in the future that non-see senses. When non-see risks painting a spectacular history of secularism, Asad sees philosophers such as Nancy as being in a lineage of thinkers who attempt to dialectically grasp the totality of the world. Such an overburdened formation of concepts represents the contemporary in its scope, according to Asad, and he is rightly suspicious of such endeavors. But I want to show in what follows very quickly that Nancy's project can also be read as being in a peculiarly individual, finite relation with its own tradition, speaking against and through it at the same time. So, I claim that Nancy writes in a certain relation to the universal and to the universalization of truth that is distinct from other deconstructive thinkers. Indeed, it is this relationship that draws Derrida's critique in On Touching, and I find Nancy here in closer contact with some unlikely bedfellows. For example, in Badiou's reading of St. Paul, instead of being universal as such, truth is the name of something that happens in the name of life, in the name of love or agape. Universality here is transformed into a universal address. a speaking of the truth to everyone, not just the truth of everything. Such a truth, it must be seen, cannot find its specific value in existing normative values, since it must inaugurate a new subject, nor can it coincide with cognitive truth or with scientific reason. So the only orientation Badiou is willing to give this is love, which subsists in the universality of the aggressor. Now, unlike Nancy, this is not love for anyone, this is not an immersion in the other, which the Islamic Muslim mystics would call fana. This is an explicitly Christian love of the kind that loves another as oneself, assuming that one must first love oneself. So, what Badiou says is that the subjective process of a truth is one and the same thing as the love of that truth, and the militant real of that love is the universal address of what constitutes it. The materiality of universalism is the militant dimension of every truth. And Nancy figures love and its relationship to truth and universality as well, but very differently. Similar terms, very differently. For Nancy, love figures in the world with something like a universality. He refers to the universality and totality of love, but rather than insisting on its necessity for the formation of truth subjects, he merely touches on how love can be seen to underwrite various philosophical movements. And he says, love is not only subject to the ontological dialectic, it does not only form one case of its ontic application. If one may say so, love is the heart of this dialectic. The idea of love is in the dialectic, and the idea of the dialectic is in love. Hegel, transcribing Christian theology into the ontology of this statement, the absolute wishes to be close to us, says nothing other than the absolute loves us, and the absolute dialecticizes itself. Love is at the heart of being. So by any measure, this is an extraordinary passage, not least because Nancy commits with few qualms to love as humanly understood. Absorption, unity, separation, movement towards and away from each other, as a universal feature of thought. But no sooner than he accomplishes this privileging of love in his philosophy, Nancy unseats it, making it infinitely singular, culturally specific. He says, that which is not the Occident is in fact no stranger to any of the figures or forms we know as love, but in all these figures, which their Occidental denominations here risk falsifying, and which moreover perhaps not figures, what is at issue outside of the Occident is not love absolutely. Only the Occident designates within love an ordering or disordering principle of the totality of beings and of beings, of nature, of the city, of knowledge, and of God. Only the Occident raises with this name, one name, love, such a claim to universality. So, while this seems shocking to non-Western eyes, or indeed to any eyes accustomed to looking for implicit, explicit exclusions in such philosophies, I think it's of a piece with Nancy's thinking of absolute singularity along with absolute generality, that is the law of philosophy, poetry, metaphor. So the universal love that he refers to is itself problematized when it reaches the limits of its cultural applicability. Love, as Nancy makes clear, is a name for a cultural value and for the place in the social and political life of a culture where it is inscribed, and further, the name of the particular experience of love within that culture. Nancy is vague regarding the boundaries of the Occident, of course, including at times, he includes Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism sometimes, but it's eminently clear that this inclusion is only partial, and only to the extent that these partake in an essential Occidentalism which is exemplified by Christianity and globalization. So for better or worse. How can Nancy assume that love is an Occidental quality, the kind of love he's talking about? He seems to be saying perhaps nothing more than that he knows love in a certain way, and that being Occidental, he will not presume to call that love which lies outside his understanding of being. But the word Occident is already an agglomeration, a formless shape-shifting mass that confuses race, geography, science in one potent weapon. Moreover, it has a history, a resonance that someone like Nancy cannot be oblivious to. I would suggest here that a more consistently radical skepticism about other minds could dissolve this particular problem and render it a certain step of a Eurocentric philosophy straining at its enclosures. Wittgenstein, in the Philosophical Investigations, explores the question of what it means to understand someone else's pain. He says, if I say of myself that it is only from my own case that I know what the word pain means, must I not say the same of other people too? And how can I generalize the one case irresponsibly? So where substituting pain for love, in Nancy's writing, we can agree with Nancy and Wittgenstein that I have only my case to attach to a word and give it meaning. Wittgenstein goes further and reverses the direction of the query. Must I know that the same applies to literally everyone? I.e., even within the group of people Nancy sees as Occidental, what guarantee has he that they're not simply nodding along without understanding when they hear him speak of love? And Wittgenstein here proposes a very famous thought experiment that I want to put alongside this, which is the beetle in the box, when he says, someone tells me that he knows what pain is only from his own case. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of the thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something. For the box might even be empty. No one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. So Nancy, on this reading, might be deceiving himself in believing that there's a collection of boxes which hold something called love, and that beyond these boxes, skepticism lies. He cannot even know, on this reading, if there is something called love. He can simply experience it as an everyday thing between people who seem to act as if they know what love is, or rather who do love, are involved in loving. It is on encountering such a presumptive skeptical border in Fraser's anthropological masterpiece, The Golden Bough, which describes certain ancient rituals as magical, that Wittgenstein argues against explanation, any explanation at all, as a way of engaging or reducing the encounter with another culture. And he says, and here the explanation is not what satisfied us anyway. We can only describe and say human life is like that. Compared with the impression that what is described here makes on us, the explanation is too uncertain. Every explanation is an hypothesis, and this is the important bit, I think, for me, but for someone broken up by love, an explanatory hypothesis won't help much, it won't bring peace. So the ethical moment for Wittgenstein, as for Nancy, is a keen and sudden sense of the groundlessness of existence, the lack of absolute explanation, which is the sort of thing in this example that someone broken up by love experiences. In other words, affinity that is experienced as a fact of life. So how does this peculiar ethical moment of love, which Wittgenstein writes about in his only essay on ethics, and then Nancy talks about as well, allow us to think between cultures and through radical difference? I'm suggesting here that the thought of Louis Massignon has something to offer, as exemplifying something between a Muslim and a Christian sensibility. So I'm talking not only about his scholarship on Islam and about the great mystic al-Hallaj and his extensive lexicons in Islamic mysticism and philosophy, but also the trajectory of his life, the circumstances of his extraordinary vocation. So Massignon, in converting to Catholicism, avoided the call of the monastic life while attempting to find a system within which the worldly and the spiritual, the present and the eternal, can subsist. So, very quickly, the facts of Massignon's life for those people who are not familiar with this thinker. He was born in Paris in 1883 from an artistic family. He pursued the study of Arabic as a young man, traveling in the Middle East, reading manuscripts in private libraries and undertaking archaeological expeditions, as one did in those days. A remarkable and mysterious event in the desert near Baghdad, which he doesn't really talk about, he alludes to it, where a combination of mortal danger from hostile tribesmen, illness and a spiritual crisis converge to produce a complete breakdown, a complete shattering, resulting in Massignon's experience of the divine as, quote, a visitation from a stranger. So this strange and little understood event became an opening for Massignon into the heart of Islamic spirituality as exemplified in the ancient tradition of Islamic Sufism, and particularly in the life and work of the ecstatic mystic and martyr Mansur al-Hallaj, 10th century mystic. Here in the Iraqi milieu of Arab hospitality, oral tradition and esoteric religious orders, Massignon began his work on the life, the teachings and the eventual crucifixion of Mansur al-Hallaj. And more importantly for us here, Massignon strove to connect the Hallajian philosophical system and his life and death to a living experience of spirituality, with abiding, if often concealed, influences in the Islamic world, as well as deep connection with his own Catholic faith. So the Hallaj, who emerges from Massignon's study is a complex and Christ-like figure, moving through a long apprenticeship in the hidden and highly metaphoric reading of the Quran. These readings on themes such as the role of Iblis or Satan on the scene of creation were traditionally in stark contrast to the dogmas of exoteric Islam. Indeed, by contemplating, for example, Satan's love for God, which in the Islamic tradition sets him in jealous opposition to man, the Sufis ventured into territory that would then, and indeed today, find them convicted of blasphemy and unorthodoxy in many theocratic states. Therefore, Sufi philosophy tends towards the metaphoric and the poetic, even as it grapples with traditionally philosophical matters of essence, potential, universality, etc. So the central quest is conducted in terms that seem to bring together both the Arab history of courtly and poetic love and the Neoplatonism that was prevalent in the intellectual and cosmopolitan environment of 9th century Baghdad. So Hallaj's mission led into a path of what is called extravagance, a term used to denote the ecstatic or unorthodox Sufism, who take the risk of ignoring dogma and uttering phrases that might seem to be wildly exaggerated or even blasphemous. Shaf, which is the communication, the one-on-one communication with Allah, and this can take the form of a loving communication, a blasphemous denial of Allah's existence or His goodness. So in one instance, Hallaj, who was orthodox in his observance in other ways, and had made multiple pilgrimages to Makkah, declared that the true Muslim need not go to Makkah anymore to perform the ritual of Hajj. Instead, her own home could become the site of the pilgrimage. He repeated several versions of phrases that implied that he was in communication with the divine, and he entered trance-like states like the Prophet Muhammad was described as doing. And finally, and perhaps most famously, he uttered the phrase Ana al-Haq, which is I am the truth in Arabic, where al-Haq is one of the 99 revealed names and essential qualities of Allah. He was reported to the authorities, controversially tried and convicted, executed in public by being tied to a stake, pelted with stones and cut into pieces. His remains were burnt and scattered to deny him Muslim burial. So, what matters for Massignon is the manner in which Hallaj's spiritual conviction brought him in conflict with the authorities, with the temporal powers of the profane world, even to the point of his own annihilation. Indeed, it is not sufficient to admire such a resolute answer to a calling of divine love. Massignon and many others have sought to extract sophisticated ethical systems from this sacrificial existence, thought, and death. Massignon in particular developed early in his studies a painstaking system of collecting and collating terms from Sufi manuscripts, explicating their most literal senses in relationships to each other and to the Quran, which is something he called an anagogical reading, which is a way of reading the movement of a text along with the text itself, and thereby spiritually enriching oneself. So in this kind of reading, we can see something of the method that allowed a Frenchman, Massignon, to convert or revert to his own Christianity under the influence of a deep love for another culture. The texts of Islam, the culture of Islam, were experienced by him as a force of displacement, or as a body of experience against which he himself must be profoundly displaced. This occurred in its most violent form as a breakdown in the Iraqi desert, but in the sophisticated and scholarly sense, Massignon can effect such a displacement by an immersion into the inspiration behind the text through its literal surface. Indeed, Massignon often refers to a faith in a mystical universalism, although this faith is tempered by a disdain for the easy or passive quietism of mystics such as Madame Guyon. If for Massignon, spiritual experience is found through an arduous traversal of a space of otherness, another text, another time, etc., then it is hardly possible to accept the value of a spirituality that arises through a simple inner contemplation. So this is something which takes as its model looking at other texts. It's not simply an inward growth, it's not a sort of meditative practice in that sense. So what this involves is a certain kind of cultural crossing, because Massignon converted to Christianity under the influence of Islam, which is the sort of kind of paradox that I'm trying to draw something ethical out of. How is this possible? So an example of this kind of crossing, which is in a concrete and extra-textual form, is Massignon's founding of the Badliya Society, where in the face of a rising European secularism and antipathy towards Islam, Christians were encouraged to pray for and with Muslims to experience their language and culture. This experience was meant to be much more than an exchange program. Massignon saw this exchange, literally Badliya in Arabic, as an act of substitution for Muslims. a continuation of Christ's substitution of himself for mankind's sins, and naturally of al-Hallaj's suicidal echo of this substitution. Al-Hallaj too, it must be remembered, ventured into blasphemy because he had a mission to die at the hands of the authorities, taking on the sins of mankind perhaps in this sort of Christ-like way. So substitution, hospitality, and otherness are the major concepts that Massignon derives over here from Hallaj. I'm going to move on a little bit. So Patrick Lord's study of Massignon's philosophy makes a strong case for the importance of space in the latter's method, specifically the act of pilgrimage and the metaphor of movement and displacement. This displacement requires an object and a place, roots as fixed points between which the eye is essentially transformed. So it is in this configuration of the relation between the divine and the human as one of desire that Massignon and Hallaj coincide most strongly. This desire can only exist if the beloved is primarily other, and the lover must negotiate between attaining unity with the other and annihilating the self, but also in the process annihilating the other as other, which is the essential basis for desire, and resigning himself to the separation, an act which denies the calling of love itself. So, what Massignon is doing here is also denying something, a certain kind of Islamic philosophy which relies on an existential monism of the kind that is most famously outlined by the 13th century philosopher Ibn al-Arabi, and it's called Wahdat al-Wujud, or unity of existence. Massignon instinctively distrusts this pantheistic universalism implicit in such a doctrine, which seemed to deny the multiplicity of the world. As opposed to this, Massignon prefers the opposing Islamic philosophical tradition of Wahdat al-Shuhud, or unity of witnessing, or alternatively unity of testifying. So he dismisses Wahdat al-Wujud as incompatible with the mystic's burning desire for God, for where the stress should be on the burning, and sees Ibn al-Arabi's philosophy as leading to a quietist serenity that eliminates the need for pilgrimage, for encounter, for preaching and fighting. So it seems for Massignon that friendship and love that are the universal principles par excellence, creating an opening into a realm of the timeless, which unites those who have access to it into a brotherhood. Now this is with the very esoteric Massignon, who talks about this sort of trans-historical picture of friendships of these souls that are in contact because they've experienced something of Wahdat al-Shuhud. For Massignon, the multiplicity of the world only becomes apparent as well in the shattering or limit experience. In the case of spirituality, this might even be an experience of evil. The lesson of the spiritual break must be internalized then in a specific way, what he calls the compassion substitution. It constitutes a mode of presence within the other, through the presence of the other, within oneself. It would be possible to refer to this substitutive compassion as a universalism through reciprocal participation according to the sacred logic of hospitality. And further, the substitution consists in definitively becoming other, in substituting oneself for the other as a sacred hostage. So, I want to quickly compare two opposing readings of Massignon, two opposing views of Massignon. One is Derrida's admiring reading of him in Acts of Religion, and the other is Edward Said's well-known critique in Orientalism. Said focuses on Massignon's understanding of Orthodox Islam, which is as a systematic rejection of the Christian incarnation, which he sees as an omission of Islam's individuality. For Said, this omission is Eurocentric. It's a desire to subordinate Islam to a Western understanding, and with the underlying assumption that Islam is somehow inherently inferior to Christianity philosophically. So this simultaneous admiration and denigration is affected by the elevation of Hallaj for his Christ-like qualities over Muhammad, who is intriguingly absent from much of Massignon's discourse. So this maneuver, it seems to say, exemplifies the central argument of his thesis. He says, the judge of the Orient, the modern Orientalist, does not, as he believes and even says, stand apart from it objectively. His human detachment, whose sign is the absence of sympathy covered by professional knowledge, is weighted heavily with all the orthodox attitudes, perspectives, and moods of Orientalism. His Orient is not the Orient as it is, but the Orient as it has been Orientalized. Now, I'm just picking up, Said, on the idea of the Orient as it is and what that might mean, because I think it's clear, at least Said refers to it in his later work, that the position of objectivity, the as it is that he's arguing from, is itself a certain kind, what he calls critical secular humanism. And it should be obvious from what I'm reading that that is something which I find problematic. The idea of the secular itself as something opposed to the religious is something which doesn't seem to me to be as innocent as it seems to Said. Now, Said admires Massignon's intuitive attempt to understand Islam, even as he sees it as part of the larger European project of universal humanities. In this sense, Said's entire project is an anti-universalist argument that seeks to protect the particularities of the Orient from scholars such as Massignon. Said is very clear that such a reading does not amount to an overlooking of the value of such work. Instead, he's attempting to demonstrate a certain consistency to the discourse of the Orient, where, seen in such a way, Massignon is less a mythological genius than he is a kind of system for producing certain kinds of statements. For Said, Massignon's depiction of Islam overflows with a Christian Pauline spirit. The seat of these ideas, according to Massignon, is the circumcised heart, which, while it is in the grip of his testimonial Muslim fervor, can, as is the case with mystics like al-Hallaj, also be inflamed with a divine passion or love of God. So against this sort of reduction, we must place Said's own later explication that despite the attractiveness of Orientalists such as Massignon or Richard Francis Burton, the great traveller, he reserves the right as a critic to respond with emotional force, to be moved, angered, surprised, and even delighted. Nonetheless, the act of placing Massignon squarely and inescapably within the discursive mechanics of his time seems to me to avoid engagement with that part of the text which escapes determination by all the known formations. In other words, Said seems to leave no space for Massignon's work to surprise or endanger his own thesis. So, compared to Said's analysis, Derrida's reading of Massignon in Acts of Religion is highly revealing of not just a disciplinary difference, but perhaps even further of a spiritual and temperamental difference. Derrida cites Massignon verbatim not just from his essays, but from his private correspondence. It is clear that what matters for Derrida is not just the theoretical affiliation between Massignon, Levinas, and himself, but equally the former's life as a work, as a body of acts, of tragedies, and political action, and of sexuality. Derrida senses Massignon's inherently tragic vision, which results in a kind of transhistorical linkage of exemplary sacrificial spirits. Nonetheless, this tragedy is one of compassion and of intersubjectivity as a destiny of the hostage, the madness of substitution of which we speak with Levinas and Massignon. Derrida demonstrates his own compassionate ethics of reading by moving, without apology, between the personal, political, and scholarly lives of Massignon, the Catholic homosexual scholar who did not particularly deny his sin, the lover of both Arabs and of the Arabic language, and most famously perhaps the man who laid the foundation for the now commonly accepted concept of Abrahamic religions. So, in the broadest terms, Massignon's thought, when desacralized, as in Derrida's hands, I think holds out the possibility of a kind of comparative scholarship based on substitution and immersion in each other's cultures, beyond the conventional critiques of concealed power structures, beyond the idea of mere exposure, which is something I think Said's Orientalism thesis is still tied to, the idea of exposure. So I just want to look at that at the end in the context of some more art, some more recent works, and to indicate the boundaries of this exposure as an artistic enterprise. I want to talk about two works of art from the 56th Venice Biennale, and one is Rashid Rana's My East is Your West. He's a Pakistani artist who works mainly with digital prints, post-minimalist tradition. But this is an installation which is part of a project called My East is Your West. Entering a room in a palazzo on the outskirts of the main exhibit, the viewer is confronted with what seems to be a reflection of the Venetian room that you're in, or at least it's double on a facing wall. So this double image is in fact a projection, a live relay from Lahore in Pakistan, where a replica of this very room has been set up in a specially constructed structure in an open urban area surrounded by shops and small businesses. So closer inspection of the projected image provides more clues. The wall of the Lahore room seems to be blurry on closer inspection, with artifacts that show that it's, in fact, what you have behind you there is a digital print from a photograph of this room. So you confronted there with your counterparts in the Pakistani room, gazing back at your image on their facing wall, or you see either the people from the art world who knew that this was happening in Lahore, or the people simply from the surrounding areas who wandered in. There's a huge difference between between the kind of atmosphere that gets created depending on who's in there. Some of these people might never have seen a European room or even seen a European. So, in fact, this portal between these two worlds of exquisite art world snobs and intellectuals and pilgrims in Venice and the others in Lahore, this asymmetry becomes very sharp. So this simultaneously returned gaze should be the scene of something like an encounter, a powerful confrontation between two worlds that meet in this artificial art space, proclaiming a mutual strangeness, but perhaps also an underlying shared form of life. So I won't speak too much about the obvious fact that there's this uncomfortable disparity of power, who's seeing who in what way, but I want to say that in my reading, this room in fact exposes a certain limitation of exposure and opening, inasmuch as what remains neutral is the frame itself, the artistic gesture of symbolic or literal testimony, shuhud, making way for an assertion of primitive universality of being, wujud, which is that the art itself aims to expose a certain pre-existing reality, to bring it into contact. You can see even sort of amusing encounters that happen there. I want to compare that, not unfavorably, but I want to talk about that work in the light of another work which was nearby in Venice, which was a work by the Swiss artist Christoph Büchel, and he accomplishes, I think, something far more unsettling. He converted for the duration of the biennial a deconsecrated Christian church into a functioning mosque, complete with the imam leading daily prayers, meeting visitors and advertising Quranic lessons. You have the typical mosque furnishings, the plastic chairs, shoddy furniture, carpets to cushion the bare feet of praying Muslims. It's not a sort of glamorous, beautiful old mosque. It's a functioning everyday mosque. What I want to say is that what is happening here is something perhaps far less immediately understandable, with far less immediate exposure of some underlying reality. But it's far more provocative in the ethical context that I've been trying to talk about of substitution. The discomfort of Venetian local authorities, I must say, meant that outside, the phrase Allahu Akbar was supposed to be outside this. It wasn't allowed because that was considered too much. The work is called the first mosque in the historic city of Venice. And it was closed down by the authorities in the end. So that inscription could not be put outside as planned on the exterior of the church, but this reveals only the resistance to an act of conversion, of imaginative substitution and sacrifice, even temporary sacrifice of identity, political, religious, etc., that is engaged in an act that is political in the Hallajian sense that I'm trying to talk about. So in reading Nancy and Hallaj together, I'm not implying that there's an identity, finally, but the possibility of a certain violent coexistence that should not disappear ethically or aesthetically in the name of preserving difference or diversity. So on this view, diversity depends on the idea of, certainly in the arts, of the idea of the artist as exot, to use the term coined by Victor Segalen, as one who seeks to consume the exotic, at great risk to both subject and object of desire. It's also refusing the Pauline idea of the abrogation of the circumcised heart, of the circumcised body in the name of the circumcised heart, which is what Badiou investigates in his study. So this diversity that I'm trying to talk about is worth maintaining through exoticism, is distinct from any celebration of creolity or hybridity insofar as these categories, by posing a third between two or more terms, tend to lead to a synthesis. If the hybrid in these terms comes into existence, it must itself find an exotic object of desire. It must itself enter the erotic fold of the diverse. So Nancy's main claim in this context is that if the world is groundless, then this groundlessness is not senselessness. The sense of groundlessness is the very opening onto nothing that he stakes his ontology on. But what is this nothing, and where does this leave us as citizens, globalists, artists, philosophers, humans? If there's only undifferentiated difference, then there's no difference at all. But this is the risk we must rescue non-C from, or that I'm saying that I'm doing. But modestly. I will add to this simply the possibility that not only must we speak for who we are, from where we are, as non-C does. He says that I'm speaking from old European humanism, which is at its end. And I think this is the limitation of non-C that I'm trying to break non-C away from. And I think that he can and he does indeed speak of much more than his old European humanism, and that he risks the substitutive sacrifice through what he is doing philosophically, and that caveat that he places often that this is, I'm a Frenchman speaking from old Europe. This is perhaps unnecessary to